the theme for this second week, Black Lives That Matter, the time of reckoning. And of course, this is a very big subject, as you can well imagine. It is, in fact, one of the most serious challenges we face for reasons which will partly become clear this evening here, afternoon elsewhere, and which we'll return to when we come to week 6. Because this is such a large question, we can't really do it justice purely by looking at it today. Well, we're all familiar with the murder of George Floyd, which led to worldwide protests, debates over the tearing down of statues, particularly in Britain, statues that celebrate key figures in the history of enslavement. And the Black Lives Movement was part of a growing recognition of the fact that racism has a structural basis, a basis that's deeply embedded in both mindsets and institutions. This is a recurring theme of the 7 weeks, mindsets and institutions. Very seldom would you have institutions having an impact which is not to some extent supported by mindsets and vice versa. There's usually a link, a correlation at least, between mindsets and institutions. Now, when it comes to racism, I think it's useful to distinguish between different forms or different ideas of racism. And we can slice the idea of racism in 2 ways. Direct or overt racism, that is visible racism. The overt forms of discrimination based on color or ethnicity. But then we have indirect or covert racism, which is less visible, lying under the surface, discrimination not easily perceptible, arising from policies or institutions that claim to be fair or neutral, have a semblance of fairness or neutrality, but are basically discriminatory. And that's the one that counts on this axis of visible, not so visible. The invisible forms of racism are so much more pervasive and far-reaching than the visible ones, which is not to underestimate the importance of visible ones. And the other way we can slice it is personal racism, individuals bullying others, harassing, being rude, physically or verbally abusing people of different color or ethnicity. And the other form on this particular axis, institutional or structural or systemic racism. That is to say, racist policies and practices that are deeply structured into a society's legal, political, and cultural institutions. And of these 2, personal and institutional, it is institutional that counts for a great deal, more than the personal. So we remember that. We're looking particularly for invisible forms of racism, or less visible ones, and institutional ones, but mindful that there are the other 2. Slide. That's what just been talking about. Okay, I think that's enough for that one. B. Now, let's look at racism in the United States. I'm going to look at the US, UK, and briefly Australia, as by way of an introduction to our 2 guests later this evening. More than 150 years after the Civil War, racism remains rampant, as I think we all know, in the United States. The legacy of African enslavement still has a powerful hold on public attitudes, policies, and institutions. And don't for a moment think that it is confined to the south of the United States. Not for a moment can we think that. What are the three most obvious manifestations of this racism? We find it in health, employment, and incarceration outcomes. A few sobering facts to begin with about Black incarceration. Black Americans incarcerated in state prisons are 5 times the rate at which white Americans are incarcerated. That is to say, per head of population. Nationally, in the United States, 1 in 81 Black adults in the United States are incarcerated. 1 for every 81 persons, Black adults. In Wisconsin, it is 1 in every 36. 1 in every 36 Black adults are incarcerated in Wisconsin. Can you imagine it? In 12 states, more than half the prison population is Black. Can you imagine that? More than half. Which states? Some of them you'll guess. Alabama, Delaware, Georgia, Illinois, Louisiana, Maryland, Michigan, Mississippi, New Jersey, North and South Carolina, and Virginia. Okay, slide. So racism is very widespread. And we need to understand the forms, the different forms that this takes. So let's have a look at this short presentation, Systemic Racism in America. Might take a second.
You might think racism in the US is really a case of a few bad apples. A racist cop here, a so-called Karen there, a leader of a white supremacist group. You know, people who deliberately hate. But we can't blame racism in America on just a few bad apples. Think of our nation's problem as more like an apple pie, with the racial injustice baked right into every aspect of our society. Meet Ebony and Emily, 2 American babies, 1 Black, 1 white, born at the same time, same place, but Ebony will not get an equal slice of the pie, and that starts from birth. Because of her race, Ebony is 3 times more likely than Emily to die in the hospital as a newborn if her doctor is white. And once Ebony and Emily go to school, while both girls occasionally misbehave, studies show they won't face the same punishment. Ebony is 7 times more likely than Emily to be suspended, and 4 times more likely to be arrested on campus. When the 2 girls grow up and apply for jobs, odds are fewer employers will call Ebony back because she has a Black-sounding name. And even though Emily and Ebony will get the same college degree, once Ebony is hired statistically as a Black person, she'll make an average of 25% less than Emily. So why didn't ebony get an equal slice of that apple pie? It's because systemic racism is built into our country's DNA. In the 17th and 18th centuries, wealthy white men needed land, so they took it from indigenous people and then forced blacks into slavery. To justify using blacks for free labor, the whites in power promoted a myth that blacks were inferior. And as Seattle-based author Ijoma Oluo points out, our nation's institutions, politics, and policies were designed against the backdrop of that money-driven lie that black people just weren't as worthy or as capable as whites.
Our school systems were built around this, our economic systems are built around this, our government systems were built around this. And it is simply that things were designed to uphold this story, to uphold this exploitation.
And even though slavery ended here more than 150 years ago, the racism that fueled it persists in systemic ways today. White Americans now hold 85% of this country's wealth. Black Americans, just over 4%, and Hispanics, just over 3%. People of color, people like Ebony, are statistically more likely to be impoverished, incarcerated, and face discrimination in healthcare. Emily may have her own barriers in life, but her skin color won't be one of them.
It's not someone said, here's your wealth because you're white. Here's your status because you're white. It simply means that the barriers that we placed in front of people of color were not placed in front of you. Now, you may have a whole nother set of barriers, right? You may have barriers of disability, barriers of class, barriers of immigration status, so many other barriers that were placed in front of you. But acknowledging privilege is simply acknowledging if we also took that other set of barriers that we place in front of people of color, you would stumble even further.
So even though you may not consider yourself a bad apple, a racist cop, a so-called Karen, or a member of an extremist group, Oluo says you may have played a role, even if you have the best intentions.
Instead of this whole, let's all learn to be best friends and love each other, you can love someone of a different race and ethnicity and still actively participate in their oppression based on how you vote, based on what you bring up in your office meetings, based on where you spend your money.
It's not too late to change the recipe of the most American apple pie.
So that's starting with a bang. Periodically then, in the US, of course, we see improvements. Most glaringly in response to the rise of the civil rights movement in the 60s. But gains tend to be temporary. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is an important improvement, was in many ways undone by Lyndon Johnson's war on crime and Nixon's war on drugs. And as a result of those two acts, the level of incarceration in the US, Black incarceration, increased sevenfold. Within a few years of the Civil Rights Act. And similar trends are to be found in health, employment, and housing. Next one. You can see these slides again at your leisure if you want to in the next few days. So this is an institutional set of practices and of policies that are leading to this situation, certainly in the United States. Now, very important to understand this little bit. So far, just a few facts, and anyone can come up with these facts, they're readily available. The point to understand is that race is a human invention. Prior to the 1500s, the term race was used, but used infrequently, and then only to refer to a kinship connection. The term race, which accompanied the rise of Europe and the growth of European empires, was then used to classify people on the basis of color, physical appearance, and genetic heredity. That came later. Race, this is the critical statement to keep in mind, race is not a biological, it is a social construction. Completely social. From the 16th century, slowly at first, but more rapidly as time went on, the new idea of race became firmly established in the European imagination. The notion that white people were inherently smarter, more capable, more human than non-white people became widely accepted. Thanks. Okay. So whiteness became synonymous with entitlement. As the well-known US professor of history, David Roediger, has put it, and I quote, European elites created races of savage Indians, subhuman Africans, and white men. The social inventions, this is the quote still, the social inventions succeeded in uniting the white colonists, dispossessing and marginalizing native people, and permanently enslaving most African descended people for generations. Tragically, American culture from the very beginning developed around the ideas of race and racism. End of quote. And so in the early 17th century, the first Africans were brought to the American colonies as enslaved labor. And increasingly, the colonists saw their future as dependent on this African labor. And importantly, the principle was established that if a woman's legal, not the father's, if a woman's legal status was a slave, then the children would also be automatically slaves. In America, white freedom, this is the important point again, coexisted and justified Black slavery. To be free as whites, Blacks had to be slaves. That's the basis of American democracy and has remained ever since. Hard pill to swallow for those who are sympathetically disposed to the United States, as are many of us, but that's the reality we have to face. And just in case it sounds peculiar, strange, odd, let me quote to you Thomas Jefferson, a founding father of the American Republic. He was the first state secretary of the United States, the second vice president of the United States, and the third president, 1801 to 1809. I quote him in his speech of September 1801. The Blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to the whites in the endowment both of body and mind, end of quote. And by the way, he goes on and it gets worse, not better. He's one of the enlightened fathers of the American Republic. And by the 19th century, science would be brought in to legitimize racism. Scientists, some of the most notable surgeons, doctors, other scientists, argued that Africans were an inferior or altogether different type, ideally suited to perpetual service. Big names in science and anthropology and medicine. And many made major contributions to the sciences and the social sciences. Dr. Samuel Morton, Josiah Nott, and Louis Agassiz feature prominently. The Civil War brought slavery to an end, but the hierarchy of race continued to structure both personal and social relationships. The debt-bonded labor system, together with segregation, entrenched a deepening racial divide. Now, much has been made of the need to reform the policing culture. But we have to remember that the policing and criminal justice systems are rooted in the legacy of slavery as a key instrument in preserving white power and control. Policing culture in the United States and elsewhere, think Australia, cannot be changed, without changing the culture of white supremacy on which it is based. What it means to be white in New York may differ a little or a lot from what it means in Georgia or France or Germany or Australia. But there is something which unites these different expressions of what it means to be white. The people labeled white, this is of course the dominant mindset that I'm describing until very recently. The people labeled white consider themselves superior. And so whiteness in time historically became synonymous with white supremacy. Next slide. Now it's true, there has been a shift in public discourse in the United States over the last 40 to 50 years. There is a predominant liberal view in the United States, not shared by many, of course, but a dominant liberal view that racism means hatred of the other, and hatred is unacceptable. But if you don't have hatred in your heart, then you can't be accused of racism. And that's what the video before made it clear, that you can't assume that. Because the institutions that you keep supporting may be racist. It's too easy, too little, to just reduce racism to personal emotions. Too easy, too little. The dark reality is that white domination continues in the United States, but not just in the United States, in corporate boardrooms, in the media, in the tech industries, and in the key levers of power, with some exceptions.
Just let the online audience know why you wanted the slide behind from what you're saying.
Because I want people to concentrate on what I'm saying and not looking at the screen. Okay. And what I'm saying is an expansion, of course, of what you're seeing. Now, in time, this new version of whiteness, the more liberal version, itself led to a backlash. Don't think that even this little amount of progress, or substantial, depending on your point of view, would go unchallenged, because many whites would now feel that the advantages of whiteness might slip away, Migration came to be seen as an existential threat. It was time to take back control to make America great again. Trump and the 40+% who support them, who support him. Yes, next. Now, let's turn to Britain. You see, I'm emphasizing the deeper dimensions of the race phenomenon. Stuart Hall, a very well-known British author, in his book, The Empire Strikes Back, said, and I quote, "The imperial flag has been hauled down in a different 100 corners of the globe." In other words, the empire has shrunk, but it is still flying high in the collective unconscious, the collective unconscious of the British people. That's what he means, end of quote. He's pointing to the extraordinary hold that the empire still has over the British psyche. The empire, what does it conjure in the minds of many in Britain? Not all, by any means, but a very substantial number. Philanthropy, hard work, higher values. The great beneficiaries of colonialism were the colonized. We did it for them, for their sake. The inequality that was at the heart of the colonial project is largely obscured. Britain is viewed as the architect of the Industrial Revolution, which in many ways it was. It is Britain that brought modernization to the world. But not much is said about the billions of pounds that were extracted from India, billions of pounds monetary currency, from India along the way. And so I'd like us to listen, to listen, David Olusoga, a leading historian in Britain, written many books, and is a broadcaster, commentator, very sought after. He is meant to be having a conversation with someone else who's also well known, Afua Hirsch, who would have loved to have joined us, but unfortunately she was not available on the day we needed her. So let's watch now David Olusoga. This is a byline. He's on his own because she had an accident on the way to the studio, and she joins him about 20, 25 minutes later. We don't see her, but we'll see him for just a few minutes.
The question I always want to ask authors when I encounter them is why did they write this book? And whenever you write a book, there comes a time, usually late at night, you think, why on earth am I writing this book? And it's important to, when you write a book, it's important to think about where it sits within the books that have been written before and the books that you hope will be written afterwards. This book it's a reply and it's a homage to a book written by Peter Fryer in 1984, a book called Staying Power, which I read when I was a teenager, and which was the first book I ever bought with my own money from working in a sports shop on my Saturday job. And it was a book that changed my life because it was a book that showed that there was a reason, there was a story that I was part of, that I wasn't just this black kid from a black family who happened to be in the north of England, like some sort of accident, that I was part of a long, long story, a story that was much longer than I could have possibly imagined before I picked up Staying Power. So this book is a response to that, but it was also a response to experiences that I had growing up and to absences. Being black and British is often about what doesn't happen, what's not acknowledged, as much as what does happen. Now, this book in some ways is a response to things that very much did happen to me, experiences of racism and racial violence, but it's also about absences, things that were invisible, that were never explained to me. As I say in this book, I was brought up in the north of England, and if you grow up in the north, if you're lucky enough to grow up in the north of England, not only are you automatically salt of the earth, but you are taught about British history in the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution. You're told that that is the part of British history that belongs to you. That was the moment when the north of Britain, the north of England, was the most dynamic place in the world. And so I was taught about spinning jennies and water frames. And I was taken on visits to factories and mills. And I was told every minute detail about how these machines worked, how these factories transformed the world. Every tiny little detail in all of these visits to all of these heritage sites and these mills, apart from one detail, which is where the cotton in the 4,000 mills of Lancashire came from. Every tiny microscopic detail of the process of turning cotton into the cloth that was Britain's biggest export throughout the 19th century, apart from where the cotton comes from. The cotton's produced by 1.8 million African Americans who are slaves, who are part of the 4 million African Americans who were slaves in the 1850s and into the 1860s in the Civil War. Those 4 million African Americans were the most valuable commodity in the American economy. Them, their bodies, their flesh, their bones, their children, who they did not own because they were enslaved, and their children were automatically the property of the people who considered them property. They were the most valuable thing in the American economy, more than every factory in the north, every ship in every harbor. And yet they would have been of no value had there not been 3,000 miles away from Louisiana and the cotton valleys, the cotton producing valleys of the Mississippi Valley. They would have been worthless had it not been for what was happening in this country. Because what was happening in the Mississippi Valley was umbilically linked to what was happening in the Lancashire Valley, where 4,000 cotton mills produced the commodities, the clothes and the yarn that were Britain's biggest export. The Industrial Revolution wasn't just about iron and steel and railways, it was about cloth, it was about cotton. The Economist reckoned, the magazine that's still running today, reckoned that about 20% of the British population were to some degree economically dependent upon cotton. There's a point when you tell children every tiny detail of the most important industry and the most dynamic and significant point in British history, when you tell people every detail apart from one detail, when an omission stops becoming an omission and it becomes a lie. And my childhood, and the reason Peter Fry's book was so important, was because it made me realize I had been lied to. These weren't omissions, they weren't mistakes, they weren't things, oversights, they were lies. And we have lies about the place of black people in our country, all over the country, all over our history. It's in books, it's also imprinted on buildings. I live in Bristol. In Bristol and in other cities in Britain, we have heritage plaques that will describe somebody as a West India planter. What does that mean? It's a meaningless phrase. It's a heritage industry invention. West India planter means plantation owner, and to be a plantation owner is to be a slave owner. Other heritage plaques will describe people as West India merchants. That doesn't mean anything. It's a euphemism. It's a way of concealing and whitewashing our past. A West India merchant is a slave trader. The Dictionary of National Biography has been complicit for years in this. There are families who have redacted the slave part of their history. And that's been repeated and regurgitated in the Dictionary of National Biography and in Who's Who and in all sorts of publications, where that element of their story has been elided, it's been forgotten, it's been disguised. It happens over and over again. And so if you're a young black kid growing up in the north of England, you don't understand where you fit into all of this. The same is true of the story of empire, the story of how my Nigerian father happened to be in Britain, why I'm sitting here speaking in English, why my ancestors encountered the British when they arrived in the 1850s in gunboats in the lagoons of Lagos. Part of studying black history is always going to be about discovering and uncovering and confronting fabrications, omissions, and sometimes the word has to be lies. But the reason that I wrote the book was not just about wanting to confront those falsehoods. It was also because of a perhaps naive but I think important belief that Britain can become a country that confronts all of our histories, that looks at the role that it played in the world.
Okay. Well, because time's moving on, I'm going to move on to a bit faster. Now, I know a few people in the chat box are concerned about what they think is the fact that some of these slides that have been shown after I've spoken rather than before. That's been deliberate. You want to see the slides again at your leisure, you will be able to. But who are we to question the desires of those who are engaged with us? So we'll now show them so if you can move on 3 or 4 slides, Ben, till we come to, I'll tell you to stop, racism in Britain. That's where we're up to. Now we're going to the next one. Okay, so what has occurred in Britain is a different version of what occurred in the UK. In the US, I'm sorry. There is a claim, which has been very strong in many parts of Europe, but in the UK, the biggest empire, the empire over which the sun never set, of a claim to historical innocence of colonialism. It was innocent. And that innocence of imperial domination remains after the empire has gone. And it expresses itself in contemporary forms of neocolonialism, and most importantly, in racism at home. Next. Now, I'm going to race through this. It's not important. You can see it in more detail. I can show you more detailed slides, make them available if you want to. But if we take COVID, the recent 2 years, after the first wave in Britain, Black Africans were 3.7 times more likely to have suffered, to have caught the virus than British whites. And for Bangladeshis, 3 times as much, and for Black Caribbeans, 2.7 times. And the reports that were commissioned by government to try and explain this situation tended to find the reasons in the nature of these ethnic minorities. There were deficiencies, inadequate cultural values, practices not alert to the dangers of the virus, distrust of government and health authorities. The one thing that was not mentioned in these reports, official reports, was the disproportionate exposure to pollution, the poor economic situation, dense housing, and the heavy reliance on public transport. In short, the unequal access to the material conditions of life, which really explain the differences in the rates of virus cases between the white majority and the BAME minorities, as they're called, acronym BAME, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups. Okay, just a couple of words about Australia, just as a bit of an introduction to the discussion we'll be having a little while later. When the first Europeans settled in Australia, they had no idea They were encountering the original inhabitants of the continent, whose history stretched back into the dream time of 60,000 years, give or take. And so these First Nations were subjected to dispossession, as we know, to killings and imported diseases. The colonizer had a clear aim to establish a European monoculture. And so an irreconcilable gap emerged, which to some extent is still with us, perhaps to a considerable extent, between the original occupants, for whom country was the basis of their spirituality, and the colonizers, for whom land was but a means to economic gain. An irreconcilable gap between the spiritual and the economic drivers as key to an understanding of life. That takes us beyond anything encountered in the US or Britain. Because, in the US they were natives, but probably not quite the same length of history. Native Americans, who were treated pretty similarly. Next. And again, a century after Jefferson, may I quote Alfred Deakin. In his speech to Parliament, September 1901, one of the fathers of federation, one of the great statesmen in Australian European history. And he said, as clearly as anyone could say, we should be one people, and I'm quoting, and remain one people without the admixture of other races. They do not and cannot blend with us, and we do not and cannot blend with them. In 1908, the Labour Party adopted as its key objectives the maintenance of racial purity. Next. And there is another important dimension, the environmental. Colonial policies and practices found expression in agriculture, in mining and manufacture. And they all depended, to a greater or lesser extent, on the rapidly increasing use of fossil fuels. That has been the hallmark of European economic development in Australia. So if I may quote from Tony Birch, a leading Indigenous author and speaker. He was named professor at the Victoria University not long ago. He makes the point, and I'll quote him, land theft and environmental vandalism went hand in hand. They were the two sides of the same coin. To quote him, in addition to direct frontier violence, structural models supporting conquest became increasingly dependent on a bureaucratic regime within which Indigenous people were catalogued, counted, and legislated against in order to perversely reinforce a status of non-existence, terra nullius. Non-people in an empty land, empty of Indigenous people, that is, which in turn refused the vitality of Indigenous ecological knowledge. Okay, so we will talk more about where to from here for Australia when we meet our two guests. Any questions? Couple of questions we may have time for. Online? Any of our participants online or here?
Do we stand up?
Yeah, protection.
So, Joe, one thing that occurs to me that may be missing from this is whether or not by simply doing nothing, by perpetuating the status quo, we ourselves are complicit in racism, in that status quo, providing for the privilege that we find ourselves in. Now, that in and of itself may be a form of racism that's not acknowledged. It's more a comment than a question, but maybe something you want to speak to.
Thank you. Is there another one? And I'll take both together and to save a bit of time. Anybody else online has a question? No. Okay, yes, of course. And that's why we have to focus on structural or systemic racism and on indirect or covert racism, because they are the more deeply embedded, the less visible aspects of racism. And therefore, though in one's personal relations, we may not be racist, and most of us are not. I'd imagine a large number of Australians in their personal relations are not racist. The question remains, and I'll talk about that much later, and I'm sure it'll come up in discussion. We are racist. It's already been said by the young woman in that first video clip. Racism is judged not only by our personal attitudes and relationships towards those of different color or ethnicity, it is judged by whether or not we changed the institutions that allow racism to be sustained. And that's a tall order, of course, but that's a question we're going to look at a bit later. And that's, of course, what our two guests, I'm sure, will be talking about. Any more? Yes.
Joe, when you're referring to institutions, are you suggesting like a government or like what is that?
Yeah. Institutions are all the institutions of government. Government is used in the popular sense. If you want to be precise, you would say the institutions of the state, not government, of which government is one of the three key pillars. So it is the legislatures, parliaments, the executive, governments, and the judiciary. These are the political institutions. But then you have the economic institutions, which in terms of large corporations are determined in the boardrooms, the policies, that can seep through to smaller, lower levels of corporate activity. And then there are the cultural institutions, and in particular, the educational institutions. They are perhaps the most powerful in inculcating racism, in making it acceptable, in teaching a history that obscures it and makes visible the benign elements of imperialism and colonialism. And history is rife with that kind of embedded obscurity of the reality of what happened in the way that we saw in the video before. So yes, institutions, and the ones that concern me most are educational and media institutions, because they help to frame the mindset, they help to frame the knowledge base that people have to make sense of the world. And we'll be talking about that at length next week. Okay. Oh, another one. All right.
Another one. When you said that in America, that white democracy and white freedom depended upon black slavery, was that because their understanding of democracy was so linked to economic prosperity and economic freedom, or was there something?
Exactly. And you couldn't have that level of economic prosperity if you didn't have that servile labor force. So it made possible, and the likes of Jefferson were even keen to see the spreading of prosperity, the spreading of wealth, because in his view, that was the basis of effective democratic engagement. So that's why one helped to make the other possible and in a sense justified.
Not the same as in Australia though. There's a difference between that, the Australian understanding of democracy, I think, from the beginning, and
Yes.
the American. Would that be right?
Yes, Australia was never terribly worried about great democratic values in the initial stages, but it was worried about material development of the continent, and for that to happen, then the land had to be taken away from those who were going there to do the two. So it was much more economic and less of the political flavor that it had in the United States. Okay, now we move on. We're 5 minutes late, but no worries. We'll now move into, we'll in our groups here physically, and we're going to be breaking up into smaller groups online. And you have just one task. It's a demanding task. One task. The group as a whole has to come up with a question. You have to practice your consensus skills and many other things. One question for the group as a whole. You just discuss it and talk it through until you've agreed that is the question we want to put up. The question to be put to our two guests. Now, so the skill that's required, first of all, what are the issues? What are they going to be talking about? They're going to be talking about constitutional reform in Australia, right? From an Indigenous perspective, right? They're going to be talking about how can Indigenous communities, the First Nations, assert a voice, a powerful voice, I'd imagine, they'll tell us, in the Australian decision-making process, a powerful voice. That's what they're going to talk about. What you discuss, what's a question, a probing question, a difficult question, a provocative question that you would like to put to them. Not, you know, don't be gentle. What's a provocative question you would like them to address? So that's the idea. Think through, in the context that I've described, what is a question that they might usefully address, unless, of course, they've dealt with it prior to us coming to question time. So have a go, talk intensely and in animated fashion. And one final thing, you have to write it on paper. And it can't be more than 4 lines. 4 lines is an awful lot of words for a question. You have 15 minutes. 15 minutes, you come up with a question, 3 lines, and it'll be collected. And it'll be collected online. It will be collected, the questions will be collected online and physically in the room here.
I love most of all is this muddy bass thing. Really? The way the artist has imitated liquid mud. To auction, I'd be putting an estimate of between £2,500 and £3,500. It's worth coming.
Hello, we have now, that's it, no more time. You can continue, excuse me, please. Next time I'll bring my bell. All right, please, if I can have your attention. You can carry on if you want to, but it'll be at the expense of your tea break. It's up to you. You can go on for as long as you like, but we have 12 minutes to have a drink or anything else that's out there. 12 minutes, and we are back here in about 11 and a half minutes on the dot, because the guests know that they have to connect and be ready to speak at 7:25. And it's very rude to be waltzing in and out when they're speaking. Hello. Say okay.
Dani and Shireen are both joining now.
Who? Oh.
I guess so.
We had lots of questions. We had lots of questions where all from different angles.
Subconscious biases are coming up. Our subconscious biases are coming up.
How much time we got left, Jared? Did you say 5 minutes?
You're worried with the government of the day, having any
Sorry? Yeah. Everyone can hear it, but yeah.
Do I have to mute or unmute?
Sorry?
I'm unmuted at the moment.
Yeah. They both have the camera and switch off, so I can put them on your screen until they turn the camera.
Okay.
is trying to fix this a little bit.
Yes. That locks it in. Yeah. I suggest, yeah, you want to see your voice. Institutional change other than governments. And then I can say an example. Governments or well, no, just take them your words. I think that's what you don't black coffee. Sorry, can you let me in? Because I made a mistake, because I closed the app and you let me in again, I now can't censor the chat. Sorry, that was Susan 11. Because that was my responsibility to look at chat. You can. Joe, are we asking questions after the presentation? No. Okay. So maybe I'll pick some questions after the presentation, so we'll be able to answer each question. Okay, that's fine. I understand. I also.
Can they hear me? Can the two speakers hear me? Dani, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hello?
How you going?
I can't hear you.
Can
And
you hear me
Shireen,
now?
are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi.
Now we can't hear her. There. It's all right. We'll be with you in 2 minutes.
No worries.
2 minutes.
Yeah. Okay, all right. Let's check it out. Yeah, that's the part for me because yeah. But
Can you hear me well? Shireen, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you pretty
Can
well.
you say something? Can we hear them?
Hello, testing. Hello.
Both of you, if I could ask you
Yeah.
to
Testing.
project so that people here as well as online can hear you well.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Is there anyone there?
Can you hear me as well?
Anyone?
I can hear you.
Yes, can hear you.
No, no, you say.
I think just Joseph can't hear us.
I think there might
Sorry,
be
I can hear you. I just was on mute. Sorry.
Oh,
If I forget, you just do that. Tell people.
I get pinch when you're talking, look at the camera, not at the
Yes.
not at the TV, not at the monitor.
Okay, we're ready to start. And there are a few stragglers from behind, but hopefully they will join us soon. Well, we have the great pleasure today. We have the great pleasure today to have two very special guests who are going to share their knowledge and insights with us. We have been looking at the whole question of race for the last hour or more in its US, UK, and Australian expressions. And we're now going to dig a little more deeply as to where we're at in a place called Australia. And we have Dr. Dani Larkin and Dr. Shireen Morris to help us in that task. I'm going to ask first Dani to say a few words, and then Shireen, and then some conversation with the two of them. And after that, questions from the floor, both the physical floor and the online floor. Dr. Dani Larkin, if I may introduce her, is a Bundjalung Kungari Kani woman from Grafton, New South Wales, a public lawyer, representative of the Senior Dialogue Leadership Group for the Uluru Statement from the Heart. She's also has a key role in higher degree research at her university and is the Deputy Director of the Indigenous Law Centre at the University of New South Wales, where she lectures. So it's with great pleasure that I ask you to address us. Thank you, Dani.
Thank you, Joseph. And thanks everyone for dialing in today. It was my absolute pleasure and honour to be invited to present in a forum like this. So thank you all. So as Joseph said, I'm Dani Larkin, and I'm a Bundjalung and Kanarakan woman from Grafton, New South Wales. So I'm up in the Northern Rivers of New South Wales. My mother's side connects me to Bundjalung country, so that's where I grew up. I actually grew up in an Aboriginal community just outside of Grafton called Baryugal. And my father's side connects me to the Kanarakan people of the Northern Territory. So luckily for me, I've been really fortunate enough to be able to grow up with my culture pretty deeply and my community and my family. And I think those things have really influenced who I am as a person when it comes to my morals and values that exist in both my personal and professional life. But before I get going, I'd just like to acknowledge the sovereign people of the Gadigal people, elders past and present of the Eora Nation, whose lands I'm dialing in from today, which is in Kensington and Sydney. So as an Aboriginal woman who grew up with my culture in a small Aboriginal community, I witnessed and experienced firsthand the ways in which the Australian system has failed us as a people. We see the impacts every year through annual Closing the Gap reports and the ever-increasing deplorable First Nations statistics within them. We see how the Australian education system still to this day does not adequately teach the full truth about Australian history that's inclusive of its First Nations people and our cultural identities. And we see how ancient sites with thousands of years of sacred cultural heritage are destroyed by mining companies. The destruction of the 46,000-year-old Yukon Gorge in Western Australia by Rio Tinto is a prime example of this happening. It was one of countless instances where cultural heritage has been the victim of the drive for development and commercial gain in Australia. And this system has provided me with confronting insights from the time I was a young kid with how First Nations people in Australia are perceived by the system. And such insights continue to become increasingly worse as the years roll on throughout my adult life. Most people I grew up with from Baryugal have died younger than what they should have because of the effects this system has had on them. Almost all of my family from Baryugal have passed on because their financial vulnerabilities were exploited from the James Hardie Mining Company when it used Bundjalung land at Baryugal as a dumping ground, even in a primary school playground for white asbestos. That company used the blood, sweat and tears from my Aboriginal community to work in the asbestos-filled bagging rooms on the mine site with no protection. So this is why much of my research centres around Indigenous self-determination, citizenship, political participation and representation, and comparative constitutional law issues. I largely examine what barriers there are in Australia that limit the political participation and representation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people when it comes to us exercising things like our right to vote, running as a political candidate, and having our own institutional national representation. We have many direct and indirect barriers that limit our exercise of self-determination rights and self-governance rights in those ways which I've just identified. And that's due to the way in which colonisation and oppression of us as a people still lives strong within the westernised Australian system. Much of what I realised in my research was that the key thing that holds us back in Australia from being as progressed, albeit not perfect, but as progressed as places like Canada and New Zealand, is that they have treaties with their Indigenous people and constitutional arrangements that recognise their Indigenous people's self-determination rights. We have nothing in Australia. Instead, we rely on principles of responsible government being upheld in minimalistic ways through voting, for example, so that the government of the day is held to account. However, the Uluru Statement from the Heart highlights two key barriers that limit Indigenous political participation in Australia when it says, proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not innately criminal people. Our children are aliened from their families at unprecedented rates, and this cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem, and this is the torment of our powerlessness. Those issues the Uluru Statement mentions come from systemic racism targeted at First Nations people, prevalent, for instance, within, yes, our overall democratic regime, but specifically within our criminal justice system, which contributes to our disproportionate and ever-increasing incarceration statistics and Aboriginal deaths in custody. Our electoral laws and policies also don't factor in those experiences when they disqualify citizens from voting at elections, be it state-based or be it at a Commonwealth level. Because in Australia, prisoners are disqualified from voting at an election if they're serving a lengthy term of imprisonment. So for Commonwealth elections, prisoners are disqualified from voting if they're serving a prison sentence of 3 years or more. And that's been accepted within Australian case law as being a substantially justified reason for limiting universal suffrage, which was what was decided in Australia's High Court landmark electoral law case of Roach and the Electoral Commissioner of 2007. Now, whilst that type of provision applies to everyone equally, it has a disproportionate impact on Indigenous people and our political participation because of our overrepresentation in prisons and high exposure with coming into police contact with an inadequate criminal justice system that doesn't understand who we are as a people, including our experiences with colonisation, and more often than not, provides us with disproportionately longer term sentences compared to non-Indigenous people that come before the courts. The Australian Law Reform Commission has identified in a few of its reports now that issue a number of times. And we're also disenfranchised from voting by being deemed of unsound mind, which is another disqualifying electoral law category we often fall into. You almost can't have one without the other when it comes to our imprisonment and our mental and emotional health, both of which we lack adequate representation with, and consequently, services for. Too often we are left with non-Indigenous parliamentary representatives and bureaucrats with minimal to no contact with First Nations people and experiences, speaking for us and making decisions about us without us. Another issue we come up against just on that point is our lacking political candidacy representation. See, you need to be eligible to enrol to vote at elections if you want to run as a candidate. And there's a percentage of us that aren't enrolled, or even if we aren't politically engaged with enough to access exercising that right to vote. Or we don't have the incentive to even be bothered to participate in a system that we don't trust in because it can't see the value of our vote, our voices, and our need for our own culturally appropriate representation. To get around those disenfranchisement issues and in an attempt to disrupt the status quo and properly deal with the vast range of issues First Nations people are being oppressed by daily, we've attempted to establish our own representative institutions. However, the legislative form of them has been weak and their existence has been left to the political whim of the government of the day. This has resulted in many national Indigenous representative bodies being established and also shortly lived and extinguished. There's been many of our institutions also designed in a way that's left us with limited power and means to achieve the institution's objectives, and some have just been government-appointed ministers, some of which are non-Indigenous, which have of course raised questions about member representation of the institution and their cultural legitimacy. Today we call for structural reform through a constitutionally enshrined First Nations voice to Parliament, which is set out in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. In 1967, we had a successful Australian referendum, and one of the things we did is that we repealed section 127 of the Australian Constitution and sought to be counted in the Australian census, like all other Australian citizens. Today, we seek another referendum. This one's to be heard. We want a national representative body elected by us, for us, so that we can take our rightful seat at the table with the confidence of constitutional protection through enshrinement of the voice, because it is what, after decades worth of work, the Uluru Statement from the Heart calls for, which was drafted by significant First Nations cultural authority from across the country. It is a modest and conservative proposal given our history of disenfranchisement and dispossession, and it would give First Nations people the necessary political empowerment to provide input on laws and policies that pass through the executive and the parliament that impact upon First Nations affairs. And enshrinement of the voice would give it the necessary political legitimacy and constitutional standing to hold government officials to account with confidence without the threat of it being extinguished by the government of the day if it disagrees with its views. This, as the Uluru Statement from the Heart suggests, is the first step towards overcoming First Nations political powerlessness and systematic racism within Australia. Thank you. I welcome questions afterwards. You're just on mute, Joseph.
Joe, you're on mute.
Joe, you are still muted.
Can't hear you, Joe, sorry.
Joe, you're on mute. Joe. Joe, we can't hear you. Joe?
Can I be heard from the people online? Okay, all right. I'm so sorry for that unwelcome interruption, but the technology has a mind of its own. So I was in the process of introducing Shireen Morris. She's a constitutional lawyer and senior lecturer at Macquarie University Law School. She has written extensively and commented on issues relevant to her research widely. Her books include Radical Heart, 3 Stories Make Us One, and more recently, A First Nations Voice in the Australian Constitution. Shireen, I invite you to say a few words to us.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks, Dani, for those really insightful remarks. Lovely to be on a panel with you. I want to pay my respects to the Darug people, the traditional owners of the area I'm dialing in from, and acknowledge their elders past and present. So a little bit about me. So as Joe said, and thank you for the invitation to join you here today. It's a real pleasure. I'm a constitutional lawyer. I was born in Melbourne. I'm of Indian and Fijian Indian background. My parents migrated to Australia from India via Fiji towards the end of the White Australia policy. And they were scholarship students and got scholarships to come here and study medicine at Monash. So I grew up a very privileged young person in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, doctor of 2 daughters. And I think one of the things daughter of 2 doctors, I should say, not doctor of 2 daughters, bit late in the evening, I think. And, you know, one of the things they instilled on me growing up, and perhaps this comes as a result of being a daughter of migrants and being of a non-white background, is that an awareness, I suppose, that Indigenous Australians haven't been treated all that fairly in our history, but also in our contemporary reality. So professionally, I went and studied law later. I was an actor and a singer throughout my 20s. Then I went to Monash and did law. And I did an Aurora internship that took me to Cape York Institute, where I met the Indigenous leader, Noel Pearson. And that changed the whole trajectory of my career. And I spent basically the last decade or more working with Noel and Cape York Institute, furthering the cause of Indigenous constitutional recognition, and particularly pushing this idea of an Indigenous representative and advisory body in the Constitution, a First Nations voice guaranteed by the Constitution, that was advocated by the historic Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017, as Dani explained. I guess there's just a couple of points that I want to add to what Dani has said. From a constitutional, legal, and political perspective, I really view the proposal for a First Nations voice guaranteed by the Constitution as what I would describe, and what Noel Pearson would describe, as a radical centre reform. So it's a reform that speaks to competing propositions and ideas and brings together different constituencies in a really productive way, in a way that has the ability to build remarkable consensus. And for this reason, I think it's a proposal that has garnered really strong, the first ever national Indigenous consensus at Uluru in 2017, because, you know, and that was historic. As far as I know, that's the first time ever Indigenous Australians nationally have arrived at a consensus on how they want to be constitutionally recognised. You know, most of the Indigenous advocacy of the past, letters and petitions to kings and prime ministers, they often emanated from individuals or from particular regions, like the Bark petitions or the Burunga statement from Arnhem Land, Northeast Arnhem Land, or William Cooper's advocacy from down south. Never before has Indigenous Australia come together, you know, north, south, east, west, urban, regional, remote, cultural differences, personality differences. So I can't emphasise enough the extraordinary and unprecedented nature of that Indigenous consensus, which really deserves to be respected. And people make a lot of the fact that it wasn't 100% agreement. Well, it was 250 delegates minus 7 dissenters who walked out of Uluru, the Green Senator Lydia Thorpe among them. Now, 250 minus 7 is around about a 97% consensus. That is extraordinary. You know, you try to get consensus among my Indian family at a Christmas dinner, you would have no chance. So to just put it in perspective, I think expecting 100% consensus is unrealistic and unfair. And I think the strong consensus that emanated from Uluru was remarkable and deserves to be respected. Now, I think it's a radical centre proposal because it speaks to Indigenous long-standing aspirations for empowerment, substantive constitutional reform, self-determination, political empowerment, but it is also, as Dani said, constitutionally conservative. So that's what I mean when I say radical centre, is that it melds these two principles that you would think were at loggerheads, right? You would think that Indigenous aspirations for substantive empowerment could not be reconciled with Australian constitutional conservatism, but the Uluru Statement shows us that it can, right? This is a constitutionally conservative proposal because it's a proposal that works with the Australian Constitution rather than against it. It upholds parliamentary supremacy, and think about it. Australia's constitution is all about voices. It's not a Bill of Rights style constitution like the US or Canada. It's a unique constitution. It works through political empowerment, and it works by giving the historic constitutional constituencies, the former colonies, a fair and equal voice. So that's why Tasmania has 12 senators, just like Victoria, just like New South Wales, notwithstanding the differences in population, because our constitution respects the principle that minority voices, even the minority voices of the historic political communities, should get a guaranteed fair say. Now, the problem was in 1901, when the founding fathers were sitting around negotiating the Constitution, there were no First Nations representatives in those negotiations. So that's why the most ancient of political communities was left out. And that is why Professor Greg Craven calls the idea of a voice in the Constitution a modest yet profound reform, right? Because it's constitutionally conservative in that it fits with the historic nature and philosophy of the Constitution. I think the best example of how this is a reform that brings left and right together is after Malcolm Turnbull unfortunately rejected the proposal back in 2017, and of course that wasn't the last word. Kevin Rudd and Alan Jones were on Q&A together, and Alan Jones explained perfectly why he thought Turnbull was foolish for doing what he did. And he said, what's so hard about this? This is an Indigenous advisory body, representative body, guaranteed by the Constitution. That doesn't sound too hard to me. And Kevin Rudd said, well, you heard it here, folks. I'm on a unity ticket with Alan Jones. So look, this is a proposal that can bring left and right together. It can bring Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians together. And I think it's a proposal that can succeed at referendum. Unfortunately, you still need political leadership, and the thing that's missing now in the current debate is we've got support growing across left and right. We've got support growing across the Australian community. What we don't have is a government that's willing to initiate the reform. So unfortunately, the Prime Minister seems incapable of seeing the massive political opportunity that's being handed to him on a platter here. The first ever call from Indigenous Australians that is backed by Conservatives, and the Prime Minister unfortunately can't see this opportunity. The final comment I would just make is that on this question of what should come first that the Greens have sort of raised, I mean, I don't make too much of that difference. I think it's Greens support every element of the Uluru Statement, and that's great. So does Labor, that's great. What they're saying is raising questions about the sequencing. I think it's quite clear that advocates have made it quite clear that a voice needs to come first, and you can see why. You can't sign it. Two parties can't sign a treaty when one party doesn't have a representative voice, right? Who's going to sign the treaty? So that's why Victoria, what's the first step they did in their treaty discussions? What's the first thing they had to do? First thing they had to do was build a First Nations voice for Victoria, because they needed an institution to undertake the negotiations, develop a treaty framework, and ultimately to sign a treaty. So just wanted to make those points, and really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Shireen, and thank you to Dani too before. Very grateful for the insights you've shared with us. Now, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, which are devil's advocate questions, and you can take them in that spirit. What do you say? Both of you have already handled the question, but I want to draw you out a little bit more, both of you, on that issue. What do you say to those who argue that the Uluru Statement is fine, but what you're likely to get from acceptance and adoption of the statement is little more than a few crumbs from the rich man's table? So, what do you say about that kind of criticism, that it is too little, too late? That's part of it. And so that I don't have to come back again, once you've handled that kind of criticism, could you both share with us, assuming things go very well in terms of the Uluru Statement, its adoption and implementation and so on, and imagine Australia in 2032, 10 years from now, where would that process have got us? What would have changed as you envision a decade from now? Will it be a lot? Will it be a little? So give us, if you like, what we might call an optimistic scenario of what could be achieved along this journey. But also, if you don't mind, give us a pessimistic scenario of what might happen. It might be that it's somewhere in between. But it's good to think of the positive things that could happen from it, but there are powerful roadblocks. How might we be able to overcome them? So a lot of questions buried in those comments. Doesn't matter in which order you speak, and you can talk across each other as well. So please go, Dani or Shireen first.
Yeah, thanks, Shireen. I think I got most of that question, Joseph. But look, I think, yeah, it's a tough campaign, and this kind of campaign and advocacy for the Uluru Statement and everything that it sets out to achieve, even before the Uluru Statement was, issued to the Australian people. There's been calls for over 2 decades now for, Indigenous constitutional recognition. So it's been a very long, drawn out process that has been frustrating, to say the least, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have been involved in this process, and all our other non-Indigenous allies that really back and support us. But this question was, first posed back in 1999 when Prime Minister John Howard put it to a referendum, but he was unsuccessful because he didn't have public buy-in, because there was no model on the table, and he didn't run a thorough consultative process. And much of what we see in the way in which, decision-making is done within Australia, be it through law or policy reform, is that Indigenous people are left out of the dialogue. So we do pretty poor processes when it comes to designing and implementing policy within Australia. And that's because we typically leave out minority groups, but particularly First Nations people. But I think, for where we're at with the campaign, Shireen was sort of talking about it before, there's a reluctance, a political sort of reluctance from our current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, in taking next steps to, timetable a referendum and progress with this type of reform. And so I think people are sort of sitting on their hands thinking, well, maybe, the campaign is now dead in the water. But there's a few things to sort of say to that. And it's, well, one, we've got a next federal election coming up in the next few weeks. So see what happens there. I think people are, really looking at the policy commitments with a totally different lens than maybe the last election, with everything that we've been through in Australia. and, you know, really thinking about whether they stay with parties they might have previously voted for or whether they're on the fence and will swing another way. But I think, you know, we've still got the numbers of support. People really want this to happen. Our democracy is meant to be about representing, you know, the interests of its constituents. And it's unfortunate when we have a Prime Minister that's acting as a bit of a roadblock when it comes to progressing with this. But what I will say is we do what we usually do as a people, and that is we're very resilient and we're experts when it comes to this type of large-scale law and policy reform, and particularly structural reform solutions that we come up with. And we push on and we wait, you know, for the next opportunity for us to get this over the line, for it to be a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament and not a legislated one. So I think in terms of it being too little too late, I think now is actually the perfect timing for this proposal to be progressed with. And I think, you know, who knows, maybe Scott Morrison will come around. That's me being optimistic. Or maybe we'll have a different kind of leadership next election. Maybe Labor will get in and people will swing that way because that particular political party has come out and said, this is part of our policy commitment. And we actually want to implement the Uluru Statement in full, including in our first term, constitutionally enshrining a First Nations voice to Parliament and pursuing that and doing what's needed to pursue that. I think where would this all get us in 30 years' time? Well, let's be optimistic. Let's say somehow this gets up and we constitutionally enshrine a First Nations voice to Parliament. It'll do enormous things for this country, for First Nations people and non-Indigenous people. It'll shift our national identity, first and foremost, into one that actually is reflective of the people it's meant to represent. And I think that's always a really good thing, particularly when we're progressing in, you know, 2022 and we don't look like a bit of a backwards or outdated nation when it comes to doing these types of things. You know, being culturally appropriate and respectful and inclusive to First Nations people. I think, you know, what it will do for the political culture in government and in Parliament is I think it'll shift the consciousness through creating this interception of those law and policy making processes, which will, you know, compel ministers to properly consult like they always should have done when it comes to making laws and policies about First Nations people. But it'll compel them to consult with voice member representatives who will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to get advice from those representatives of how to do law and policy making better when it comes to our affairs. And I think, you know, that in and of itself, you know, it changes the political culture. It changes the way in which we do these processes, which is actually making it better again. It's about making ministers, you know, be more considerate and actually do the work and consult and have conversations, have a dialogue with people whose interests are affected by any decision that they make within Parliament and the government. And I think that's a good thing. So, and then, you know, thirdly, finally, I would say, well, obviously, you know, having a mechanism like this that's protected, that can't be taken away, you know, gives us the empowerment as a people and support to actually make change that we're always advocating for. We're always protesting. Black deaths in custody, you know, looking at all the statistics across the National Closing the Gap Agreement, our children being aliened from their families and their culture. We can have a say on how those decisions are made so that we can better those statistics and those outcomes. And so that we're leaving this place, you know, and passing the baton on to our descendants. And it's a more, you know, it's a better space politically and culturally for them to live in and thrive in and feel included in. And I think that does amazing things to someone's mental and emotional health. And, you know, it's about humanity. So that's what I would say for that. Shireen?
Yeah, Dani, I agree. So to this question, is it too little, too late? Well, firstly, through the Uluru Statement, Indigenous people have told us this is what they want, right? So I don't think it's productive for non-Indigenous people, and I know progressives always want to be, trying to be doing the right thing and whatever, but I don't think it's productive for progressive non-Indigenous people to ask, is this too little? Indigenous people have told us it's not too little. Now, my own personal opinion is that a preamble is too little. Something merely symbolic in the Constitution is absolutely too little because it will change nothing. A merely legislated voice is too little because it's too easy to get rid of. And we've had legislated bodies in the past, as Dani has said. I'd reiterate the argument that this is modest yet profound, right? So if we think about the impact it could have over time, it could be profound, and we should hope it will be profound, because we've got a gap that is getting wider, suicide rates in Indigenous communities that are spiraling out of control, incarceration rates, deaths in custody rates. What is the plan to fix those problems? And I think the Uluru Statement presents us with the only compelling structural reform plan. So in answer to your question about what would we like to see happening in 10 years, well, we want to see the Voice, members of the Voice, working productively with government and Parliament to make better laws and policies, better targeted laws and policies to help improve outcomes in Indigenous affairs. So I would hope, for example, that in 10 years' time, some of the problems, a classic example is you've got well-meaning legislation in native title law and other state land rights systems that hinder economic development for Indigenous communities and tie many Indigenous communities up in red tape. I could imagine representatives of the Voice working with parliamentarians and government to try to fix up that legislation to help promote sustainable economic development in line with Indigenous community preferences and self-determination, to help drive economic reform and help close the gap, and I could imagine the Voice working with government and Parliament on many issues that are in dire need of reform across Indigenous affairs. So that's what I think we should hope would happen. But, it's to take the pessimistic view, it won't happen if all Australians don't push really hard for it. Non-Indigenous Australians, I think, bear a really big responsibility here. This has now, Indigenous leaders have been calling for forms of constitutional reform, better political representation since the 1920s, if not before. Now, it's 5 years now since the Uluru Statement was enacted. And I think we need to ask ourselves as non-Indigenous people, are we doing enough here to force government to listen, to force government, both sides, to act on this reform? So I think, yes, there's a pessimistic outcome would be that this change doesn't happen. The gap continues to widen. Nothing changes, things get worse in Indigenous affairs. And I think that would be an atrocity for which we should all bear responsibility. So I would like to see non-Indigenous Australians doing much, much more to hold the politicians to account, to make them pay electorally if this doesn't happen. You're on mute, Joseph.
Thank you, Shireen. I don't think my thanks was heard the first time round. I hadn't done muted, but thank you very, very much, both of you, for your very interesting responses to the deliberately provocative question I asked. Now, we're going to have questions from the participants. Time is always an issue, but we'll try and see how many questions we can deal with. Yes, please.
I've wrote written question, got the written questions here, Joe, from the room and
from the room
online.
Just online.
Both of them, yes.
Okay. And do you have a particular order in mind?
Not really.
No.
All right. But I might...
Just a second, Lee. Can Lee be heard? Shireen, Dani, can you hear me?
It's quite difficult to hear. If you could come closer to the microphone.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Thank you both for your presentation. I might just give some background to this. We divided ourselves into groups in the room and came up with a question per group. And then each of the online participants were put into groups and each also came up with a question per online group. I've had the unenviable task of choosing some of the questions to put to yourselves. So in no particular order, and I might just ask 2 questions at a time. And if we have some further time, then I can ask some more questions. But to start with, and this may be a question more for Shireen, and then I'll ask a question perhaps of Dani. Shireen, do you think are we best to start change first from education, or should the change come from policy? That's the first question. I'll leave you to mill on that while I ask the question of Dani. Dani, if I can ask you this question, please. How can we, as non-Indigenous Australians, learn to listen first, then to identify and take pride in Australian Indigenous culture without appropriating or assuming Indigenous culture? Thank you both.
Okay, should it be policy first or educate? That's kind of like a chicken and the egg argument, isn't it? Who was the politician that said we can fart and chew gum at the same time, or walk and chew gum at the same time is the sanitized version of it? I think policy feeds into education, you know, like public education programs probably start with policy, and then the more public education you have then feeds back into policy change. So I think we don't have any time to waste and we need to be doing all these things at once. So part of the challenge in instigating policy change is educating the public and educating politicians. And I think that's what all law reform advocates do, is they do a lot of education of the public and politicians. But at the same time, we need to be doing the constitutional and legislative reform that the Uluru Statement asks for. But you're right. I think in order to get change the hearts and minds, there is an education bit that needs to happen. And I think that is happening right now. So forums like this are part of it. And as long as we keep continuing to have the conversations, then that is all part of education.
I think for, the question I was asked, so, I mean, it really comes back to some of the stuff I touched upon before when it comes to like good policy making and what we don't really see in Australia when it comes to policy design and consultation. And that is that we leave, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people out of the conversation. You always hear in a protest, stop making decisions about us without us. And, that's the crux of the issue. So I think, the way in which, you engage in this space as a non-Indigenous person is by simply just asking, all right, start a dialogue. So, reach out to elders, traditional owners, like your local council representatives who are Indigenous. So by that, I mean land council, and, make the right connections and be guided by us, because we're, as a culture, like our character as a culture is, we're really giving, obviously, and we're really forgiving, and we're really kind, and we want to work with people, and we want to, engage respectfully with, one another, like us and our others. And I think that's really important. I think, people sort of sit on their hands sometimes, and, racism and going through these types of processes is, yes, of course, uncomfortable, but that's the space you need to be comfortable in. It's about being comfortable with the uncomfortableness of engaging with a group of people with a really dark history, and learning exactly what it is, like what are your racial biases, what is your role to play in, moving forward and taking action that's progressive, that's respectful, that's culturally appropriate and inclusive, in a really meaningful way, that gives, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people respect as sovereign people. And I think a lot of the issues that we have within Australia is, coming to terms with, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's status as a peoples within this country. It's a race relations issue that, is the unfinished business of Mabo. This is our unfinished business that needs to be, sorted out. And it takes a variety of different things in order to do that. But I think first and foremost, it takes, maturing, as people, as a nation, as a legal system, to properly comprehend the sovereignty and the different ways, a very complex, multifaceted way sovereignty of being exercised. And we need to, do the learning and do the listening. And whenever in doubt, reach out to an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person whose interests might be affected by what you're doing, and just engage in that space with them. Be guided by, rights that are outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the UNDRIP, free, prior and informed consent. I think if you're always guided by even just that right and principle in and of itself, you'll always be engaging safely and respectfully with Indigenous people on, issues that affect them. Any other questions?
Couple more questions.
Yeah, thank you both. And I'll ask these two questions of both of you. I see them in some respects as a flip side of the same coin. So the first question is, in your view, what instruments of institutional change other than governmental, so governmental, for example, being legal, treaty, voice to parliaments, so what instruments of institutional change other than governmental would ensure a path to reconciliation? And then the second question is, if the three principles of the Uluru Statements of the Heart, being truth-telling, Macquarie and treaty, and representative advisory Indigenous body to federal parliaments are accepted at the political level, how do you see those implementations flowing through to other parts of society, be it business, educational, media, civil society, etc.? Thank you both.
That last question is a big one. Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to go first. I'll give it a crack, and I know Shireen will probably cover my butt afterwards. So in terms of like the first one, not just directly looking at voice, treaty and truth, I think, we come back to things that Shireen actually spoke about when she was, giving her presentation, and it comes back to what the Constitution actually promises us and what our democratic regime promises us. And that is, voting rights, which I sort of talked about, but really, like more broadly, it promises us, political inclusivity, right? And it promises us, through that we can engage in a space and be consulted with, particularly even when we look at, what was meant to really happen after the 1967 referendum, which, I spoke about it, repealed Section 127 of the Australian Constitution, but it also shifted lawmaking power on, race back to the Commonwealth. And the intent, basically there was to give Commonwealth the responsibility and the power to make laws about, people according to their race. But, namely the way in which we've seen this play out is that provision has been directed at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But what it was meant to do was open up a dialogue when it came to the Commonwealth, making laws about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But it didn't in effect. So, in practice, it didn't really change much at all, which is why we've always, advocated for things like a voice or, ATSIC, which was another national representative body, that, you know, did really well in terms of its functionality back in the day. But I think, you know, overall, you know, our system promises us this, you know, convention of responsible government and holding ministers to account. But, you know, First Nations people, plus many other Australians in this country, you know, are frustrated with the fact that these things don't actually work in practice. So, you know, it's one of the main reasons why, you know, there's calls for even a, you know, ICAC to be able to, you know, audit and oversee the actions of ministers, you know, within federal parliament. And it's about, you know, I think people are realising that these institutions, you know, are failing us, and the way in which they work in practice is, you know, well, they're not working at all, or in a very, very limited way. So I think things like that, and I think when you look at, you know, constitutional sections like 7 and 24, and, you know, the right to vote and, you know, being represented, I think, you know, that kind of democratic representation, you know, is already there. It's already promised. I think now we're shifting to a point of, okay, well, what does this look like in an actual, you know, tangible sense through further reform? And this is just what we're meant to be doing as a country anyway. Constitutions aren't meant to be, you know, just standing in time and be forever. They're meant to adapt and change with the circumstances and the needs of the people that it's representative of. And unfortunately for us Australians, though, our constitution is notoriously hard to change. It's one of the hardest legal documents in the world to change. So that's probably why we grapple with a lot of these issues, and why we have, you know, constitutional advocates and lawyers out there wanting to change the rule book of how we do referendums and how we change that document. On the I could probably have waffled on too long, and now I've forgotten what the second question is, so maybe I'll even just leave that to Shireen.
Yeah, Dani, thank you for that. So
Is there anything to add to the first?
We've only got a few minutes left, as I understand it, in this part of the presentation. So Shireen, if you could just perhaps give us a few comments just to sum things up from your perspective.
Yeah, look, just that I think non-government mechanisms for institutional change, civil society plays a huge role, I think. And we can already see the corporate world playing a role in pushing change. So both within corporations and corporations pushing government and society along. Churches and, you know, religious groups play a role. So I think there's opportunity for each of us to reach into our networks and try to instigate change in that way. In terms of how the Uluru, 3 elements of the Uluru Statement will filter into other parts of society, you know, it's a really good question. And I think one good phrase that Noel Pearson always uses is that Indigenous constitutional recognition in a broader sense should be about bringing Australians together, and in particular bringing together the 3 parts of Australia's story. You know, the ancient Indigenous heritage that really is the inheritance of all Australians, if we could only understand and appreciate that. The inherited British institutions, democracy, the rule of law, again, we all benefit from those institutions. And our multicultural achievement, the waves of migrants that came here, my family was a part of one of those waves. We need to conceive of this as about all Australians and bringing all Australians together. And I think if we continue to approach this reform in that spirit, we will see the benefits of that unity and that reconciliation filtering in to society more broadly, I hope.
Thank you very much, Shireen and Dani. We're very much indebted to both of you for sharing knowledge and insights, may I say wisdom, and we wish you very well in all your future research, writings and advocacy, and we wish well for the Uluru Statement as well in the coming months and years. The real effort has yet to be made, and no doubt we'll have to wait after the election to decide how that effort should proceed. But thank you again. It's been a pleasure to have you both as part of this second week of the series. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Be heard? Okay. You're stalwarts, but you must keep at it for a little while longer. We now want to go into our groups again, and I have 3 probing questions to ask each group. 3 questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to put it up on the screen, so make a note. Very simple question, very short. Is Australian society, and if you belong to another society, it applies to you too, ready to embrace reconciliation, truth-telling, and the constitutional legal changes that will make it happen? Question 1. Secondly, remember your human network. You've been busy working on it. Are the members of my human network, each one of you individually, ready to embrace that? No, you're saying some would and some wouldn't. Doesn't tell us a thing. We need to go deeper into your human network. And 3, the easiest question of all, am I ready? Am I ready with all that that implies? If I say, yes, I am. Off we go.
Joe, can you repeat the first one again? There was a bit in it.
Well, it's the same question. Is the society ready to embrace it?
Embrace what?
Embrace what? Embrace reconciliation and truth-telling, and what this means legally and politically, including things like freedom of statement. Are the members of my network ready to embrace it? And am I ready? Is that fairly clear? Yeah. Off you go.
How much time, sir?
Sorry?
How much time?
Quarter of an hour.
Yeah.
So off you go in your various groups, online and here in person.
Are we coming through? I don't think we're in a group yet.
I think we're all together, aren't we?
All together, all one big group, one happy family.
Yeah, I was sort of waiting for the group to emerge, but you know, the joys of actually working off an iPad. My iPad went dead, so I had to plug it into the wall for a while to get a bit of energy in it. Right?
You should get a solar self.
Yeah, I should.
I have to interrupt your discussions with an apology. The apology is we've had a technical hitch, and we want to break you into your small groups. Did you hear the questions I posed for discussion?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, reconciliation in society, yes.
So with a bit of luck, we'll be able to divide you into the groups. Apology for the waste of a couple of minutes' time.
I did notice that there are fewer people now, so maybe fewer.
I don't think that'll affect it one way or the other.
No, okay. Okay, well. Okay, well, where are we? Switch active speaker. What are we doing? Oh, okay. I think we're sort of bit. Good to see people on the weekend. It'll be good to see. Good to talk. What's land to change your. Good to see people on the weekend. It'll be good. It'll be good to see people on the weekend.
No sound.
I'll try to turn your volume.
Can people online hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
You are
It's a very tinny, echoing sound.
Echoing.
Can people hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, right. First 2 or 3 minutes, I want to take by way of preparation for next week. Right. Next week, we're going to have an exercise which will be based around the completion of your human right, of your human network. Not today, next week. So please bring it with you, not to share with anyone, just for yourself, because there'll be some questions. And you'll only be able to answer them if you have a sense of the names in front of you. Okay? So you'll only be able to share in your group discussion if you can see the names of the people that you say are part of your network. And remember, as comprehensive as it can be. Anyone you know on this planet. Anyone you know on this planet. Okay. I'll send a couple more instructions online, but that's the gist of it. So complete it and bring it with you. Bring it to your screen online or physically with you in person. You can have your laptop with you in person or you can have it on pen. Now, second thing, we're going to do next week is we're going to have a debate in which 6 of you will participate. 3 supporting a proposition and 3 opposing. It would be better if those who would like to participate in this debate were to speak for the side with which they feel most comfortable, rather than debating for the sake of it. We're not here to score points. We're here to go into depth in the question at hand. Okay? We're not going to be a parliamentary type debate, point scoring, useless. And Ben will put up the question in a moment. The question, yes. Okay. Well, you can see. So it puts the onus away from where it would normally be. The media barons, the journalists, the political class. So it's asserting the proposition that the real obstacle to an informative and thought-provoking media is the ill-informed, unengaged citizen. If we had well-informed, well-engaged citizens, we would have a much better media. They would demand it, they would make sure it happens. You agree or you disagree? So I want 6 people. How many are online? 47. So 3 or 4 from the online participants and 2 or 3 from here, but we'll have to end up with 6, 3 on each side. So who would like to debate arguing that the major obstacle to an informed, informative, thought-provoking media is the ill-informed, unengaged citizens? Who would like to argue that point? There we have 2 hands, 3, too many men. Women, who are much more interesting debaters normally. No, more interesting. But we'll have men too, don't worry. So can we have some women from here first, in person, and then we'll look online. Some women who are prepared to argue that point of view.
Someone online has put their hand up.
Who's that?
Emily Theobald.
Yes, very good. That's one. We'll argue that proposition. Any others? 2 women and a third. I think you were the first to put up your hand, Casey. So it's Emily, right? Emily, a scholarship holder, and Susan and Casey. Now, to take the opposite, a different view, not necessarily opposite, say, no, I don't quite agree with this because the major obstacle is not the ill-informed, unengaged citizen. Who would like to argue that? Online, first. Any takers online? Do we have any takers? I can't see at the moment.
Not yet. I'm monitoring it, Joe. I'll let you know if something pops up.
Now, please come to the party. It's essential. If you don't feel comfortable, that's good. The whole purpose of this is to bring people out of their comfort zones. That's the whole purpose of the exercise. Bring you out of your comfort zone. Feel very uncomfortable. The more uncomfortable you feel, the more successful you see. So, any takers?
Samiro.
Samiro, all right. Yeah. That's one. Another one.
Are you still asking for online?
Online, another one online. We'll stop until someone puts up their hand, please. Don't take too long. We're keeping people away from...
You have a second?
Who?
Maureen.
Who?
Toril Purcell.
Toril Purcell.
Yeah.
Very good. Now, can we have someone from here? Thank you. Name, please.
Jared.
Jared. Thank you, Joe. So we've got the three. Now, what we'll do is we'll put the two lots of three in touch with each other. Because we don't want each of you to be saying exactly the same thing that the other two will say. All right? So some division of labour, and you'll have a week to exchange one or two emails. Okay? We'll send those emails to the 6 of you tomorrow. Is someone taking the 6 names down?
I just wondered about that. I'm writing furiously, but I haven't committed to memory the first 3.
Emma, Lee, Theo Gold, Susan.
Who are we? B-O-E-Y.
Yeah.
And you've got the last second 3?
And I got Jared, over there. Yeah. Tutorial. And
Having lunch somewhere would be nice.
Samira Douglas.
Samira, that is right. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. All right. So that's homework for next week. Now, just a closing comment or two, and we can all go home. One thing that I won't spend time on, which I will send you, is a page which shows the 20 years of effort towards reconciliation. And one of the last of the milestones in this 20-year period is the Uluru Statement. 20-year period, it doesn't take into account the current Europe Justice Commission, Royal Commission established by the Victorian government, whose purpose is to facilitate truth-telling and healing, educate the wider Victorian community, and develop recommendations for institutional and legal reform. The interim report is expected in June of this year. The final report 2 years later. It's going to be a major process of listening in the in-between period. We shall see whether it amounts to much or it is just another report. Time will tell. Now,
someone's asking how long the debate will be.
I'm sorry, I'll send more instructions, 3 minutes each. 3 minutes each, 18 minutes, and then we'll open it to the floor and they will grill you. They will grill you. Not me, I won't say a thing. But the rest of the group will have lots of probing questions. Why did you say such and such and so on? All right. So, concluding remark. Well, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. The Commission, the Uluru Statement, the voice, if it comes to pass, they are just instruments. They're not more than that. They are means to an end. And the end has to be laying the foundations for an ongoing process of reconciliation. And reconciliation, if it is to be serious, has to be dialogical. Dialogical. So what are the key elements? I'll just name them very quickly. First of all, a revisiting of the whole story of white-black relations. Facing up, so far as the non-Indigenous communities are concerned, facing up to the neglected and painful truth of European sustained injustice and giving voice to the Aboriginal presence on this land. In other words, hearing and listening to this voice, one of the keys to a reconciled Australia. Second, a readiness on white Australia's part to own the crimes of the last 2 or more hundred years. Experience not as guilt. Guilt is useless.
Yeah, sure.
But acknowledgement that current practices and relationships still bear a link to the sins of the past. They haven't yet broken the link. That awaits to be done. It's not just history, it's the present that's troublesome. Thirdly, a call to forgiveness And that's very poorly understood, unless you have a deep philosophical understanding of forgiveness. What does that mean? It doesn't mean saying, I'm sorry. Waste of time. Of course, say it. It follows. A commitment to repair the damage that has been done and continues to be done. And that means the self-dispossession. The self-dispossession of those who have dispossessed. If you're at the bottom of the economic pile and the political pile, you won't have to give up much. If you're above the bottom, you have to give up more and more. And if you're at the top of the pile, an awful lot, probably most of what you've got. That is the third key to reconciliation. The Uluru Statement, as you can see, is a long way from there. And it has to be done eventually, otherwise no reconciliation. You can't say, I'm sorry, but I'm keeping everything that I've stolen from you, but I'm terribly sorry. And fourth, a willingness to grant the dispossessed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island communities a secure land base, a very large part of Australia, not the cities, and a legally guaranteed future, of which the Uluru Statement is a step in the direction. And again, a step in the direction, the Uluru Statement, the beginnings of a new social contract, which will have to find a social contract between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia, which eventually will have to form the basis of a treaty that may require a whole set of laws to be declared null and void. A whole set of laws and some constitutional provisions to be ditched. Otherwise, no reconciliation. And then the last, the sixth, you'll be pleased to hear. And the most important of the six, hasn't been mentioned much. An appreciation by non-Indigenous Australians of the living wisdom of Indigenous Australians accrued over more than 60,000 years in unceasing adaptation to the land we call Australia. From the tropical island habitat of the Torres Strait to the desert of the centre, from the rainforest of the tropical north to the temperate rainforests of Tasmania, from the Reverie Basin of the Murray-Darling to the lapse-spring environment of Lake Eyre. The extraordinary relationship of Indigenous Australians to the environment, unmatched anywhere else in the world, unmatched, 60,000 years doing it. I think the best thing I can do to close is to quote from Amberlyn Guayamulina, a Palyuku woman, writer and artist. She says, for Aboriginal peoples, country is much more than a place. Rock, tree, river, hill, animal, human, all were formed of the same substance by the ancestors who continue to live in land, water, sky. Country is filled with relations, speaking language and following law. No matter whether the shape of that relation is human, rock, crow, wattle. Country is loved, needed, and cared for. And country loves, needs, and cares for her people in turn. Country is family, it is culture, it is identity, country is self, country is me. And that should be the basis, the argument goes, of our economic and political relationships.
Do we have a copy of
Yes,
your 6 points?
yes. All right, see you all next week.